With Apache warriors surrounding her and a knife at her throat, Sarah's desperate insistence that the baby wasn't hers fell on deaf ears. The warrior's hand froze mid-strike when the silver locket swung open, revealing his name, Takoda, engraved beside the portrait of a woman with his same fierce eyes. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Arizona Territory, United States summer of 1882. The sun descended mercilessly over the parched plains of Arizona, transforming the horizon into a golden shroud that seemed to consume everything before it. Dust danced in lazy whirlwinds as the wind whispered secrets among the cacti and shrubs twisted by the heat. In the midst of that brutal landscape, a solitary figure moved forward with determination, her slow but resolute steps marking a winding path along the nearly erased trail. Sarah Bennett pressed her straw hat against her head, her long, delicate fingers, nurse's hands, as they used to say, adjusting the protection against the unforgiving sun. There was something in her gaze, a mixture of exhaustion and purpose, that contrasted with the apparent fragility of her silhouette. The simple cotton dress, worn at the hem from the long journey, stuck to her body from sweat, and the small bag of medicines swung against her hip like a pendulum, marking each step. Just a little further, she murmured to herself, although she knew Phoenix was still at least 2 days' walk away. The settlement where she was to take up her post as a traveling nurse now seemed too distant, almost a mirage as illusory as the lakes that sometimes seemed to form on the horizon. That's when the sound reached her ears, so fragile that at first she thought it was just the wind. But then it came again, unmistakable in its desperate urgency. A baby's cry. Sarah stopped, her heart racing as her eyes scanned the terrain. About 50 yards away, partially hidden by a heap of rocks and dried shrubs, was the carcass of a wagon. The marks were evident even from a distance, broken wheels, torn canvas fluttering like a spectre in the wind, belongings scattered like dead leaves across the ground. "My God," she whispered, as her feet automatically moved toward the wreckage. The crying became clearer with each step. It wasn't the continuous lament of a frightened child, but the intermittent cry of an exhausted, dehydrated baby fighting with its last strength. Sarah knew that sound. She had heard it many times during her years of nursing in Boston before accepting the call to the West. The sight that greeted her paralyzed her body for a moment. The bodies were there, partially covered by canvas and sand that the wind had accumulated. A man and a woman, young, their eyes still open in an expression of frozen horror. The attackers, bandits or Indians, there was no way to know, had been merciless. Marks from bullets and arrows told the story of a quick attack with no chance of defense. And then, wrapped in a blanket stained with dirt and dried blood, protected in a space between broken crates, was the baby. A girl, Sarah realized as she knelt beside her. She couldn't have been more than 6 months old, her cheeks sunken from dehydration, lips parched, little eyes half closed, struggling to focus on the face now leaning over her. "You're safe now," Sarah murmured, feeling tears form in her eyes as she took the small creature in her arms. I'm here. With the gentleness that only an experienced nurse could have, Sarah examined the girl, relieved to find she had no apparent injuries. A miracle considering the fate of her parents. Gently, she rocked the baby against her chest and took a small canteen from her bag, wetting her fingers and moistening the child's dry lips. It was then that she noticed the small locket attached to the blanket, a piece of worked silver with delicate designs that didn't seem of American origin. She opened it carefully and found inside a miniature portrait. A young woman with delicate features and deep eyes who seemed to look directly into her soul. "I'm going to protect you," Sarah promised, closing the locket and tucking it back with the child. "I don't know how." but I'm going to take you to a safe place." The sun continued its relentless descent, painting the horizon with shades of red and orange that resembled diluted blood. In the distance, a cloud of dust indicated movement. Riders, perhaps, but impossible to tell whether friends or enemies. News of Apache raids had intensified in recent weeks, leaving a trail of terror among the settlers. Sarah stood up, pressing the baby to her chest. There was no time to bury the dead, nor strength to carry more than what was strictly necessary. With renewed determination, she adjusted her bag, wrapped the child in her own shawl, and resumed walking. Each step now had a new purpose, each heartbeat a new promise. "We're going to survive this," she whispered to the girl who, exhausted, had finally fallen asleep in her arms. "I promise." Night fell quickly in the desert, bringing with it a chill that bit through Sarah's thin dress like tiny needles of ice. The baby stirred against her chest, whimpering softly as the temperature dropped. With careful movements, Sarah gathered dried brush and created a small, sheltered fire, just enough to provide warmth without creating a beacon for any roaming eyes. "Shh, little one," she whispered, rocking the child gently. "We can't risk a bigger fire tonight." The baby's face was illuminated by the flickering flames, her features relaxing as the warmth reached her tiny body. Sarah studied her closely, noting the high cheekbones, the straight black hair, the copper undertones of her skin. She wasn't entirely white, Sarah realized. Perhaps her mother had been indigenous or had mixed blood. In these territories, such unions were not uncommon, though rarely acknowledged openly. Sarah dampened a clean cloth from her medical bag and gently wiped the baby's face and hands. The child's dark eyes followed her movements with an intensity that seemed beyond her months. When Sarah offered her water, the baby drank eagerly, her tiny hands clutching at Sarah's fingers. "You need a name," Sarah said softly, trying to distract herself from the gnawing worry about what tomorrow would bring. "I can't keep calling you little one, can I?" The silver locket caught the firelight, drawing Sarah's attention again. She opened it carefully, studying the portrait inside. The woman had the same high cheekbones as the baby, the same intense eyes. On the opposite side of the locket, Sarah noticed something she had missed earlier, a single word engraved in the silver, Takoda. "Is that your mother's name?" Sarah wondered aloud, "or perhaps your father's?" The baby gurgled in response, her tiny fingers reaching up to touch Sarah's face. "Well, until I know more, I think I'll call you Hope." Sarah smiled, the irony not lost on her. Hope was in short supply out here, yet this tiny life, against all odds, had survived. As the night deepened, Sarah kept watch, dozing in short intervals, but never fully surrendering to sleep. The desert was alive with sounds, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of nocturnal creatures seeking prey, the whisper of sand shifted by the wind. Each noise made her hold the baby tighter, her hand never far from the small Derringer pistol tucked in her medical bag, a parting gift from her father when she announced her decision to travel west. "You always were too stubborn for your own good, Sarah Bennett," she could hear him saying, his Boston accent thickening with emotion. "Just like your mother, God rest her soul." Sarah had left Boston 3 months ago, turning her back on a comfortable position at Massachusetts General Hospital and an engagement to a respectable doctor who saw her more as an ornament than a partner. The West needed skilled nurses desperately, and Sarah needed something else, freedom perhaps, purpose, a chance to prove she was more than just a well-bred woman destined for a well-appointed home. Now, cradling a stranger's child in her arms, miles from civilization, Sarah wondered if she had found more purpose than she had bargained for. Dawn arrived with cruel swiftness, the rising sun immediately asserting its dominance over the land. Sarah had managed to feed the baby with a mixture of water and crushed biscuit, softened to a paste, Far from ideal, but it would sustain the child for now. "We need to reach water by midday," Sarah murmured, studying the horizon. Her canteen was dangerously light, the contents barely enough for one person, let alone two. She had heard of a spring located near the main trail. If only she could find it again, after veering off to investigate the wagon. With hope securely wrapped against her chest, Sarah continued her journey. The desert stretched before her like a vast, hostile sea, waves of heat already beginning to distort the horizon. Her lips were cracked, her throat raw, but she refused to take more than the smallest sips from the canteen, saving every precious drop for the baby. By mid-morning, the sun was a hammer beating down upon them. Sarah's steps had slowed, her breathing labored. Hope had grown quiet, too quiet. Alarm shot through Sarah's heart when she realized the baby had stopped fussing entirely. "No, no, no," she whispered frantically, finding a small outcropping of rocks that offered meager shade. She laid Hope down carefully, checking her pulse, her breathing. The baby's skin was hot to the touch, her little chest rising and falling too rapidly. "Stay with me," Sarah pleaded, her voice cracking. She used the last of the water to dampen a cloth, placing it gently on the baby's forehead. "Please, Hope, don't give up now. We're going to make it. We have to." In the distance, a cloud of dust rose from the earth. Riders approaching fast. Friend or foe, Sarah couldn't tell, but in her current state, she had no strength to run, no place to hide. All she could do was hold the baby close and pray that whatever was coming would bring mercy rather than the swift justice of the desert. The riders emerged from the heat haze like phantoms, their outlines shimmering and indistinct before solidifying into a dozen mounted warriors. Their bodies were adorned with paint and leather, feathers and beads catching the sunlight as they approached with silent precision. Apache warriors, their faces set with purpose, their eyes scanning the terrain with the intensity of predators. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She had heard the stories every settler in the territory had. Stories of raids and scalping, of women taken and children slaughtered. Her fingers tightened around the small derringer, though she knew it would be useless against so many. Instead, she curved her body protectively over Hope, whose weak cries had resumed as if sensing the approaching danger. "Hush now," Sarah whispered, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Hush, little one." The warriors formed a semicircle around her, their horses snorting and pawing at the ground. Sarah raised her head slowly, forcing herself to meet their gaze. If she was to die here in this unforgiving desert, she would do so with dignity. One rider moved forward, his horse a magnificent black stallion with white socks. He was younger than the others, his face unmarked by the lines of age. But there was something in his bearing that spoke of authority. His hair hung in two braids, adorned with small metal discs that caught the light. Across his bare chest, a pattern of white paint formed symbols Sarah couldn't decipher. He dismounted with fluid grace, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. When he spoke, his voice was deep, the English accented but clear. "The child," he said, extending his hand in a gesture that was both demand and command. "Give her to me." Sarah's throat constricted with fear, but she forced herself to speak. "I can't," she said, surprised at how steady her voice sounded. "She's sick, dehydrated. She needs care." The warrior's eyes narrowed dangerously. "The child is not yours to protect, white woman." "I found her," Sarah said, desperation creeping into her voice. "Her parents were killed." "By white men," the warrior interrupted, his voice hard as flint. "Bandits who thought they could steal from the Apache and escape." His eyes shifted to the bundle in Sarah's arms. "That child belongs to my people, to me." Sarah blinked in confusion. "To you?" The warrior stepped closer, towering over her. "I am Takoda, son of Chief Black Hawk of the Chiricahua Apache." His hand moved to a knife at his belt, the blade glinting in the harsh sunlight. And that is my sister's child you hold. The name sent a jolt through Sarah's body. Takoda, the name engraved in the locket. Not a mother's name or a father's, but this man's. She looked down at Hope, seeing now the resemblance in the high cheekbones, the straight black hair, the intensity of the gaze. Your sister's child, Sarah repeated softly, pieces falling into place. The woman in the locket, she was your sister? Something flickered across Takoda's face. Surprise, perhaps, or a momentary softening. He held out his hand again, palm up. The locket, show me. With trembling fingers, Sarah reached for the silver pendant still attached to the blanket around Hope. She carefully detached it and placed it in Takoda's outstretched hand, watching as his fingers closed around it with something like reverence. Takoda opened the locket, his eyes studying the portrait within. A muscle worked in his jaw, the only sign of emotion on his otherwise impassive face. My sister, Nayeli, he said quietly, almost to himself. She married a white trader against our father's wishes, left our people to live in his world. Sarah swallowed hard, sensing the grief beneath his controlled exterior. I'm sorry for your loss, she said softly. Takoda's gaze snapped back to her, as if remembering her presence. His eyes hardened again as they fell on the child. The baby comes with us, he said, the command unmistakable in his tone. She belongs with her people. Sarah instinctively tightened her arms around Hope. She's sick, she repeated, fear and determination warring within her. I'm a nurse. I can help her. Please, let me at least... Enough! Takoda cut her off, his patience clearly at an end. He gestured to one of his warriors, who dismounted and approached with purposeful strides. You will not keep what is ours. The child returns to the Chiricahua today. Sarah looked at the baby's face, at the tiny features now screwed up in discomfort, and made a decision that would alter the course of her life forever. If you take her now, without proper care, she will die before sunset, Sarah said, her voice low but unwavering. She met Takoda's fierce gaze without flinching. Is that what you want for your sister's daughter? To join her mother in death before she's even had a chance to live? The words hung in the desert air between them, heavy as storm clouds. The warriors behind Takoda shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between their leader and the white woman who dared to challenge him. One of them muttered something in Apache, his voice harsh with suspicion. Takoda held up a hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. For a long moment he seemed to be measuring her, weighing her worth against some invisible scale. Then, with deliberate movements, he crouched down to her level, his face just inches from hers. What is your name? He asked, the question unexpected. Sarah, she replied, swallowing hard. Sarah Bennett. And you claim to be a healer? I'm a nurse, she corrected, trained in Boston. I was headed to Phoenix to work at the new settlement hospital. Takoda's gaze shifted to the baby, who whimpered softly in Sarah's arms. With a gentleness that seemed at odds with his warrior's bearing, he touched the child's forehead with the back of his hand, his brow furrowing at the heat radiating from her skin. She burns with fever, he observed. Yes, Sarah confirmed. She needs clean water, shade, and medicine. She hesitated, then added, I have some remedies in my bag, but not everything she needs. Takoda was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stood in a fluid motion and issued a command in Apache to his men. The warrior closest to Sarah dismounted and approached, leading his horse by the reins. You will ride with Nashota, Takoda said, gesturing to the horse. The child stays with you for now. Relief flooded through Sarah's body, so intense it made her lightheaded. Thank you, she said, struggling to her feet with hope clutched against her chest. Takoda's expression hardened. Do not mistake necessity for kindness, Sarah Bennett. You live because the child needs you. When she is well, your usefulness ends." The threat was unmistakable, but Sarah found herself more focused on the practical concerns at hand. "I need water for her as soon as possible." Takoda nodded once and spoke to another warrior who approached with a water skin. Sarah accepted it gratefully, carefully tipping a small amount between Hope's parched lips. The warrior named Nashota helped Sarah onto his horse, mounting behind her with practiced ease. The sensation of being enclosed by a man's body, of feeling the heat and strength of him at her back, brought a flush of embarrassment to Sarah's cheeks. In Boston, such proximity would have been scandalous. Here in the desert, it was simply survival. As the band of warriors set off, Sarah clutched Hope with one arm, while her other hand gripped the horse's mane. They rode at a steady pace, the landscape blurring around them as they followed trails invisible to Sarah's untrained eyes. Takoda led the group, his straight back and proud posture a silhouette against the burning sky. "Where are you taking us?" Sarah dared to ask Nashota, her voice barely audible over the rhythm of hoofbeats. "To the summer camp," he replied in halting English, "near the mountains. Water there, cool caves." The knowledge that they were headed toward water and shelter eased some of Sarah's anxiety, though her situation remained precarious at best. She was entirely at the mercy of these warriors, men who had every reason to hate white settlers like her. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had come west seeking freedom and purpose, only to find herself a captive, with her life hanging by the thread of a baby's health. They rode for hours, the sun climbing to its zenith before beginning its gradual descent. Hope drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes crying weakly, other times lying so still that Sarah had to press her fingers to the baby's chest to reassure herself that she still breathed. By late afternoon, the flat desert began to give way to rockier terrain. In the distance, mountains rose like sentinels against the sky, their peaks painted in shades of purple and blue. Sarah could see vegetation increasing as they rode, scrub giving way to scattered juniper and pine. "Not much farther," Nashota said, noticing her exhausted posture. "Water soon." Sarah nodded gratefully, her throat too dry for speech. The hours of riding had taken their toll on her body, unused to such exertion. Every muscle ached, and the skin of her face and neck felt scorched despite her hat. As they crested a small rise, Sarah caught her first glimpse of the Apache camp. Nestled in a protected valley, a collection of wickiups formed a rough circle around a central clearing. A small stream wound its way through the valley, bordered by cottonwoods and willows whose green leaves seemed almost miraculous after the barren desert. Takoda raised his hand, and the party halted. He turned to face Sarah, his expression still guarded but less hostile than before. "My people do not welcome white faces," he said bluntly. "You will stay apart, in a wickiup at the edge of camp. My grandmother will watch you. I need clean cloths, a pot for boiling water, and herbs if you have them," Sarah replied, focusing on the baby's needs rather than her own fear. Takoda studied her for a moment, then gave a curt nod. "It will be provided." His eyes fell on Hope, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of something besides anger or suspicion, a softness, perhaps even fear. "Save her," he said quietly. "Save what remains of my sister." The wickiup assigned to Sarah was small but sturdy, its dome-shaped frame covered with brush and hides that provided blessed relief from the relentless sun. An elderly woman with silver hair and a face mapped with deep lines waited inside, her dark eyes appraising Sarah with neither welcome nor hostility, merely assessment as one might evaluate a tool for its usefulness. "This is Nijoni, my grandmother," Takoda said from the entrance. "She knows healing ways. She will help you with the child." Sarah nodded respectfully to the older woman, who returned the gesture with dignified reserve. Without asking permission, Nijoni moved closer to examine Hope, Her gnarled fingers, gentle as they touched the baby's forehead, checked her pulse and pulled back the blanket to look at her tiny limbs. The old woman spoke to Takoda in Apache, her voice low and musical despite the gravity in her tone. Takoda listened intently, then turned to Sarah. She says the child is very weak. The fever fights in her blood. She asks what medicines you would use. Sarah knelt beside Nijoni, setting her medical bag on the earthen floor. First, we need to cool her body, she explained, opening the bag and retrieving a small bottle. This is willow bark extract. It reduces fever. She demonstrated the dose with her fingers. Mixed with water, just a few drops. Nijoni nodded, her eyes sharp as she watched Sarah prepare the medicine. A young girl appeared at the entrance with a clay pot of water and clean cloths, setting them down silently before disappearing again. My grandmother says she will make a tea as well, Takoda translated, from plants that grow by the stream. She says both medicines together will be stronger than one alone. Sarah hesitated only briefly before nodding. Her medical training had taught her to be suspicious of folk remedies, but she had also seen enough to know that indigenous knowledge often held wisdom that Western medicine was only beginning to understand. "Thank you," she said directly to Nijoni, who acknowledged her words with the barest hint of a smile. For the next several hours, Sarah and Nijoni worked side by side, taking turns cradling Hope, administering tiny amounts of medicine and bathing her small body with cool cloths. The baby's cries grew stronger, which Sarah took as a hopeful sign. She had enough strength to voice her discomfort. Takoda came and went, his presence a shadow at the edge of Sarah's awareness. Sometimes he stood silently at the entrance, watching. Other times he brought food or fresh water before disappearing again. When night fell, he returned with extra blankets and a small oil lamp. "You should rest," he told Sarah, his voice less commanding than before. "Nijoni will watch the child for a while." Sarah shook her head, though exhaustion pulled at her like weights tied to her limbs. "I need to monitor her temperature through the night. The next few hours are critical." Takoda studied her for a moment, then settled himself cross-legged by the entrance of the wickiup. "Then I will stay as well," he said simply. In the soft glow of the lamp, with Nijoni's gentle humming creating a soothing backdrop, Sarah found herself studying Takoda's face. The harsh lines of earlier had softened somewhat, revealing a young man perhaps no older than her own 28 years. His features were strong, high cheekbones, a straight nose, full lips pressed together in concentration. In another world, another time, she might have found him handsome. The thought startled her, inappropriate in its intimacy. She quickly returned her attention to Hope, adjusting the cool cloth on the baby's forehead. "What was she called?" Sarah asked quietly, breaking the silence. Before I found her." Takoda looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "Ayana," he said after a moment. "It means eternal blossom." "Ayana," Sarah repeated softly, testing the name on her tongue. "It's beautiful." "It was our grandmother's choice," Takoda said, gesturing to Nijoni, who had dozed off in the corner. "In our way, the grandmother often names the children." Sarah nodded, absorbing this piece of their culture. "In my world, babies are usually named after relatives or biblical figures, though that's changing now." The conversation lapsed into silence again, but it was a different kind of silence, less tense, almost companionable. As the night deepened around them, with Ayana's breathing growing steadier between them, Sarah felt the first fragile thread of understanding stretch across the vast divide that separated her world from his. Dawn broke with gentle fingers of light filtering through the wickiup's entrance. Sarah stirred from her unintended slumber, momentarily disoriented, until her eyes fell on Ayana. The baby lay sleeping peacefully in a small cradle board that hadn't been there the night before. Nijoni must have brought it during the night. Sarah reached out with trembling fingers to touch the child's forehead, relief washing through her when she felt the coolness of normal temperature. "The fever broke in the night," came Takoda's voice from the entrance. Sarah looked up, surprised to find him still there, his silhouette outlined by the early morning light. "You stayed," she said, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. "It is my duty to protect what remains of my sister," he replied, though something in his tone suggested there might be more to it than simple obligation. Sarah pushed a strand of loose hair behind her ear, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. "Ayana is much better," she said, redirecting the conversation to safer ground. "The worst has passed, but she'll need careful attention for several more days. Proper feeding, clean water." Takoda nodded, stepping fully into the wiki-up. In the morning light, Sarah could see he had changed his clothing. He now wore a clean buckskin shirt decorated with intricate beadwork over fringed leggings. His hair was freshly braided, and the war paint had been washed from his face. "My people will gather today," he said. "They wish to see Nayeli's child, to welcome her home." The word home hung between them, a reminder that Sarah's time with Ayana was borrowed at best. She swallowed the sudden lump in her throat. "Of course," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "She should meet her family." Nijoni entered then, carrying a small pot of something that smelled sweet and nourishing. She spoke to Takoda, her weathered hands moving expressively as she gestured towards Sarah. "My grandmother says you must eat and wash before the gathering," Takoda translated. "She has brought food and will show you to the women's bathing place at the stream." Sarah's cheeks flushed at the thought of bathing in an unfamiliar place among people who still viewed her as an outsider at best, an enemy at worst. But the prospect of washing away 3 days of desert grime was too tempting to refuse. "Thank her for me," she said, accepting the bowl of grain porridge sweetened with berries. After she had eaten, Nijoni led her to a secluded bend in the stream where a screen of reeds offered privacy. The old woman provided her with a cake of soap that smelled of pine and a clean dress, not her own, but a simple garment of soft buckskin decorated with subtle patterns along the hem and sleeves. Sarah hesitated before accepting it. "I can't take someone's clothing." Nijoni shook her head and pressed the dress into Sarah's hands, speaking a few words in Apache. Though Sarah couldn't understand the language, the meaning was clear enough. The dress was offered freely. The cool water of the stream was blissful against Sarah's skin. She scrubbed away the dust and sweat, watching the evidence of her ordeal swirl away in the current. The soap left her hair smelling of forest and herbs, a scent so different from the perfumed toiletries she had used in Boston. When she emerged, dressed in the buckskin garment, she felt transformed in some subtle way that went beyond mere cleanliness. Nijoni nodded in approval, then gestured for Sarah to sit on a flat rock by the water's edge. Without explanation, the old woman began to comb and braid Sarah's long brown hair, weaving small white beads into the strands as she worked. Sarah sat still under the gentle ministrations, touched by this unexpected kindness. When Nijoni finished, she placed a hand briefly on Sarah's shoulder, the first voluntary contact the old woman had initiated. "Thank you," Sarah said softly. Nijoni's dark eyes, sharp despite her age, seemed to look straight through her. She spoke a single word, then turned to lead the way back to camp. As they approached the central clearing, where members of the tribe were beginning to gather, Sarah saw Takoda waiting with Ayana in his arms. The sight of the warrior holding the tiny infant with such careful tenderness made her heart twist in a way she wasn't prepared for. The Apache had formed a loose circle in the clearing, their faces solemn yet expectant. An elderly man sat on a woven mat at the head of the gathering, his long white hair adorned with eagle feathers, his deeply lined face a testament to decades of survival in this harsh land. Chief Blackhawk, Takoda's father, Ayana's grandfather, regarded Sarah with piercing eyes as she approached with Nijoni. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and Sarah felt the weight of dozens of stares, some curious, others openly hostile. A young warrior near the edge of the circle spat on the ground as she passed, muttering words she couldn't understand, but whose meaning was unmistakable. Takoda stepped forward, Ayana cradled carefully against his chest. The baby was awake, her dark eyes taking in the colorful gathering around her with quiet intensity. Someone had dressed her in a tiny buckskin gown, decorated with intricate beadwork, and a small amulet hung around her neck on a leather cord. "Come," Takoda said to Sarah, gesturing for her to join him before his father. Sarah hesitated, keenly aware that she was an intruder in this sacred moment. But Nijoni gently pushed her forward, and she found herself standing beside Takoda in front of the chief. Blackhawk spoke, his voice deep and resonant despite his advanced years. Takoda translated in low tones for Sarah's benefit. "My father asks how you came to find his granddaughter." Sarah swallowed hard, conscious of choosing her words carefully. "I was traveling to Phoenix when I heard a baby crying. I found a wagon that had been attacked. Ayana's parents..." She faltered, glancing at Takoda. "Continue," he said quietly. "The truth must be spoken." "They were dead," Sarah finished. "I couldn't leave her there alone. I didn't know who she was or where she belonged. I only knew she needed help." Takoda translated her words, adding something more that Sarah couldn't understand. The chief nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face as if searching for deceit. After what seemed like an eternity, Blackhawk spoke again, this time directly addressing the gathered tribe. His words seemed to carry weight, flowing like water over stones, sometimes gentle, sometimes forceful. The crowd responded with murmurs and nods, though Sarah noticed the young warrior who had spat earlier watching her with undisguised contempt. "What is he saying?" she whispered to Takoda. "He speaks of my sister Nayeli," Takoda replied, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "How she left our people to marry the white trader James Miller. How our hearts were broken by her choice, but how the spirits have returned her daughter to us through your hands." Sarah absorbed this, pieces falling into place. "James Miller," she repeated softly. "That must have been the man with the wagon." Takoda nodded grimly. "My sister wrote to me in secret, letters carried by friendly traders. She spoke of her husband with love, though I could not understand how she could love one of those who had taken so much from our people." There was pain in his voice, old wounds still raw beneath the surface. Sarah wanted to offer comfort, but knew no words that could bridge such a chasm of grief and cultural division. Blackhawk raised his hand, and a woman stepped forward carrying a clay bowl filled with a dark liquid. The chief dipped his fingers into it and drew a symbol on Ayana's forehead, speaking words that needed no translation, a blessing, a welcome, a promise of protection. Then, to Sarah's surprise, the chief gestured for her to kneel before him. When she did, he dipped his fingers again and drew the same symbol on her forehead. The liquid felt cool against her skin, its scent earthy and primal. "He honors you for bringing his granddaughter home," Takoda explained, a new respect in his voice. "He says you have the heart of a true mother to risk yourself for a child, not your own." Warmth bloomed in Sarah's chest at the unexpected acceptance, though she knew better than to mistake it for true belonging. She was still an outsider, tolerated for the moment because of her actions, but never one of them. The gathering continued with ceremonial songs and dances celebrating Ayana's return. Women came forward bearing gifts, a tiny pair of moccasins, a doll made of corn husks, a blanket woven with symbols of protection. Through it all, Takoda remained at Sarah's side, occasionally explaining aspects of the ceremony or translating particularly important words. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah noticed the hostile warrior from earlier in deep conversation with several others, their glances in her direction growing more frequent and more pointed. "That man," she said quietly to Takoda, "he doesn't want me here." Takoda followed her gaze, his expression hardening. "Nahele," he said, the name sounding like a curse on his lips. "He was promised to my sister before she chose the white man. His heart turned bitter after she left." "He blames all white people for his loss," Sarah guessed. "Yes," Takoda confirmed, "and he is not alone in his thinking. There are many among us who have lost family to white soldiers, white diseases, white lies." He turned to face her fully, his dark eyes intense. "You have been granted protection for now, but do not mistake ceremony for safety, Sarah Bennett." The warning sent a chill down her spine despite the afternoon heat. "What happens when Ayana no longer needs me?" she asked, voicing the fear that had shadowed her since their first encounter. Takoda's gaze shifted to the baby, now being held by an admiring group of women. "That," he said quietly, "is for the council to decide, and for the spirits to guide." It wasn't the reassurance she had hoped for, but Sarah appreciated his honesty. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the gathering, she found herself studying Takoda's profile. The proud set of his jaw, the straight line of his nose, the depth of emotion in eyes that had seen too much suffering for one so young. In another life, they might have been friends. In this one, they were reluctant allies bound by a child's need, walking a precarious path between worlds that had only ever met in violence. Days melded into each other as Sarah settled into an uneasy routine within the Apache camp. Each morning, she woke in her small wickiup at the edge of the settlement, checking first on Ayana, who grew stronger with each passing sunrise. Nijoni would arrive with food, flatbread, berries, sometimes dried meat, and together they would tend to the baby's needs. The women of the tribe kept their distance, watching Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Only a few, following Nijoni's example, dared to approach her directly. Mostly older women whose lined faces had witnessed enough of life's cruelties to recognize that enemies could wear many faces, just as friends could be found in unexpected places. On the 5th day, as Sarah sat outside her wickiup grinding herbs for a salve under Nijoni's instruction, she became aware of eyes upon her. Glancing up, she found Nahele watching from across the clearing. His arms crossed over his chest, his expression dark as a thundercloud. When he caught her looking, he made a gesture, fingers across his throat, that required no translation. Sarah's hands trembled as she returned to her task, accidentally crushing more of the delicate leaves than intended. "Do not fear him," came Takoda's voice from behind her. Sarah startled, turning to find him standing just a few paces away, his approach silent as always. "He wants me dead," she said quietly, stating the obvious. "He wants many things he cannot have," Takoda replied, settling beside her on the ground. He took the stone grinding tool from her hands, demonstrating the proper motion with practiced ease. "Like this," he said, "gentle but firm. The plant gives its medicine best when respected." Sarah nodded, accepting the tool back and mimicking his movements. "Has he always been so angry?" "Nahele was once different," Takoda said after a moment, his gaze distant. "He and I grew up together, like brothers. He was full of laughter then, but war changes men. He lost his father and 2 brothers to the Bluecoats in a single day. His mother died of grief soon after." Sarah's heart contracted painfully. She had heard stories of the cavalry's campaigns against the Apache, but sitting here among people who had lived through such losses made the reality impossibly more immediate. "I'm sorry," she said softly, knowing the words were woefully inadequate. "It is the way of our time," Takoda replied, though there was no acceptance in his tone, only a bone-deep weariness. Our people are being pushed into smaller and smaller spaces, forced to surrender or fight. Either choice leads to death, just by different paths. They worked in silence for a while, the rhythmic scraping of stone against stone oddly soothing. In the distance, children played a game involving hoops and sticks, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Ayana slept peacefully in a cradle board propped against the Wikiup's entrance, her tiny face relaxed in dreams. "She looks like Nayeli did as a baby," Takoda said suddenly, his eyes on the sleeping infant. "Same stubborn chin." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "My sister was always strong-willed. Even as a child, she questioned everything, challenged everyone. Our father said she had been given twice the usual allotment of spirits." Sarah smiled at the image. "Is that why she chose to leave, her independent spirit?" Takoda's expression grew somber again. "Partly, but there was more." He hesitated, as if weighing whether to continue. James Miller was not like other white men we had encountered. He learned our language, respected our ways. When smallpox came to our camp 3 winters ago, he brought medicine, stayed to help the sick when even his own kind warned him away. His voice lowered. He saved Nayeli's life, and she gave him her heart in return. "You respected him," Sarah realized, hearing the grudging admiration in Takoda's voice. "I understood him," Takoda corrected. "A man does not choose where the lightning of love strikes. But I warned my sister that their path would not be easy. The world is not kind to those who cross such boundaries." The personal nature of his words, the rare glimpse into his thoughts, made Sarah bold. "Have you ever been married?" she asked. Takoda's eyes met hers, something unreadable flickering in their depths. "No," he said simply. "A war chief's life leaves little room for such things." Before Sarah could respond, a commotion broke out across the camp. Riders were approaching. She could hear the distant thunder of hooves, see warriors reaching for weapons, women hurrying children to safety. Takoda was on his feet in an instant, his hand going to the knife at his belt. "Stay here," he commanded, his tone brooking no argument. "Keep Ayana inside the Wikiup." Sarah scooped up the baby, her heart racing as she ducked into the shelter. Through the entrance, she could see Apache warriors forming a defensive line at the edge of camp, Takoda moving to take his place at their center, his posture radiating authority. The riders appeared over the ridge, a dozen men on horseback, dust billowing behind them. Not soldiers, Sarah realized with relief, noting the absence of uniforms. But not friendly traders either, judging by the weapons prominently displayed and the hard set of the men's faces. From her position, Sarah couldn't hear the exchange that followed, could only watch as Takoda stepped forward to meet the apparent leader of the newcomers. The tension was visible even at this distance, shoulders rigid, hands hovering near weapons, horses pawing nervously at the ground. Nijoni appeared beside Sarah, her weathered face creased with worry. She spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing for Sarah to move deeper into the Wikiup, away from the entrance. "What's happening?" Sarah asked, though she knew the old woman couldn't understand her words. Nijoni's response was to press something into Sarah's hand, the silver locket that had been found with Ayana. The old woman closed Sarah's fingers around it, her grip surprisingly strong, her dark eyes intense as she spoke again in Apache. Though Sarah couldn't understand the words, the urgency in Nijoni's tone was unmistakable. Sarah looked down at the locket in her palm, then at Ayana's sleeping face. Something was very wrong, and somehow this small piece of silver was at the heart of it. The confrontation at the edge of camp lasted less than half an hour, but to Sarah, watching from the shadows of her Wikiup with Ayana clutched against her chest, it felt like days. The leader of the newcomers, a broad-shouldered man with a sun-weathered face and a distinctive red bandana, seemed to be doing most of the talking. his gestures becoming increasingly agitated as the discussion progressed. Takoda stood firm, his posture revealing nothing, though Sarah had come to recognize the slight tilt of his head that indicated his growing anger. Whatever the man wanted, Takoda was not inclined to give it. Finally, the riders turned their horses and departed, though the stiff set of their backs suggested the matter was far from settled. As they disappeared over the ridge, Sarah released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Takoda returned to camp deep in conversation with the tribal elders, their voices too low for Sarah to hear. She noticed Nahali among them, his animated gestures suggesting he was arguing fiercely for something the others were reluctant to agree to. Nijoni touched Sarah's arm, gesturing for her to remain inside the wickiup. The old woman's face was etched with concern as she arranged additional blankets around the entrance, as though creating a barrier against more than just the evening chill. As dusk fell, bringing with it the familiar sounds of the camp settling for the night, cooking fires being stoked, children being called home, the distant song of night birds, Takoda finally appeared at the entrance to Sarah's shelter. "We must talk," he said without preamble, ducking inside to join her. In the dim light of the small oil lamp, his face looked carved from stone, all sharp angles and shadowed hollows. He sat across from her, his eyes going immediately to Ayana, who slept peacefully on her cradle board. "Those men," Sarah began. "Who were they?" "Bounty hunters," Takoda replied, his voice tight with controlled rage. "Led by a man called Reese Dixon. They search for a white woman they claim has stolen a valuable item from a prominent family in Tucson." Sarah frowned in confusion. "But I've never been to Tucson. I came directly from—" "They believe you have this," Takoda interrupted, pointing to the silver locket that now lay on the blanket between them. "They say it contains proof of a mining claim worth thousands of dollars. They say James Miller stole it from his employer before fleeing with my sister." Sarah's hand went instinctively to the locket. "That's absurd. It's just a family keepsake with your sister's portrait inside." "Is it?" Takoda's gaze was intense. "Have you looked carefully at what else the locket contains?" With trembling fingers, Sarah picked up the silver oval, turning it over in her palm. It seemed heavier than she remembered, somehow more substantial. The clasp was stiff, requiring gentle pressure to release. Inside was the portrait of Nayeli that Sarah had seen before, her delicate features captured with remarkable skill on the tiny canvas. But now, Sarah noticed something she had overlooked in her initial examination. The opposite side of the locket wasn't empty, as she had assumed. A thin piece of paper had been pressed flat against it, nearly invisible unless one knew to look. Carefully, using the edge of her fingernail, Sarah extracted the folded paper. As she unfolded it, she saw it contained a small, precise map, with annotations in a neat hand, alongside what appeared to be a legal description of land boundaries. At the bottom was a signature and official seal that even she recognized as representing the Territorial Land Office. "A mining claim," she whispered, understanding dawning, "hidden in plain sight." "Yes," Takoda confirmed grimly. "My sister wrote to me of James's discovery, silver, in the mountains north of here. He had been working as a surveyor for a mining company, but when he found this deposit, he chose to file the claim for himself instead of reporting it to his employers." "And they found out," Sarah guessed. "They suspected," Takoda corrected, "but had no proof until recently, when a former friend of James betrayed his confidence for reward money." "These bounty hunters, they don't care about Ayana at all, do they?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "They care only for the silver that lies beneath the earth," Takoda said, bitterness edging his voice. "Dixon made it clear. They will take the locket by force if necessary, regardless of who stands in their way." Sarah clutched Ayana closer, a fierce protectiveness surging through her. "What can we do?" Before Takoda could answer, a commotion erupted outside. Shouts, running feet, the unmistakable crack of a rifle shot. Takoda leapt to his feet, knife already in hand as he moved toward the entrance. "Stay down," he ordered, but before he could step outside, the hide covering was ripped aside. Naheli stood silhouetted against the night sky, his face contorted with rage, a rifle in his hands. Behind him, smoke rose from several wiki-ups, flames beginning to catch and spread through the camp. "The White Devils have returned," he snarled, "with more men. They attack from the south." His eyes fell on Sarah, hatred burning in their depths. "This is your doing, white woman. You led them here." "No," Sarah protested. "I would never." "Enough!" Nahele cut her off, raising his rifle. "The council was weak to let you live. I will correct that mistake." In the heartbeat of silence that followed Nahele's threat, time seemed suspended. A moment stretched thin as Sarah stared down the barrel of the rifle, Ayana clutched protectively to her chest. Then Takoda moved, faster than Sarah could track, stepping between her and the weapon. "Stand aside, brother," Nahele growled. "This woman has brought death to our camp." "The bounty hunters were already searching," Takoda countered, his voice level despite the tension vibrating through his body. "She did not lead them here." Outside, the sounds of battle grew louder, shouts and gunfire, the terrified screams of children being hurried to safety. The air grew thick with smoke, and somewhere close by, a horse shrieked in pain. "We waste time," Takoda continued urgently. "Our people need every warrior. This is not the moment for vengeance." Nahele's finger tightened on the trigger, indecision warring with rage on his face. Then another explosion rocked the camp, close enough to shake the ground beneath them, and his expression hardened into resolve. "This is not finished," he warned, before disappearing back into the chaos of the night. Takoda turned to Sarah, decision crystallizing in his eyes. "There is a cave," he said rapidly, "half a mile up the eastern ravine. Nijoni will show you. Go now, while Dixon's men are focused on the south end of camp." "But I can help," Sarah protested. "I'm a nurse. The wounded will need—" "Ayana needs you more," Takoda cut her off. "The locket too. It must not fall into Dixon's hands." As if summoned by his words, Nijoni appeared at the entrance, another woman at her side, younger, with a determined set to her jaw. The old woman gestured urgently for Sarah to follow. "This is my cousin's daughter, Kiona," Takoda explained quickly. "She knows the hidden paths. Trust her as you would me." Sarah hesitated, torn between the urge to flee with Ayana and the pull to stay, to help, to not abandon these people who had sheltered her. "What about you?" Something flickered in Takoda's eyes, a warmth, a regret, gone almost before she could name it. "I must defend my people." Without warning, he reached out and took Sarah's face between his hands. The touch was electric, unexpected, his calloused palms warm against her skin. "You have a brave heart, Sarah Bennett," he said softly. "Keep my niece safe. Keep her loved." Then he was gone, melting into the smoke-filled night, the gleam of his knife catching the firelight as he moved toward the sounds of battle. Kiona tugged at Sarah's arm, her expression brooking no argument as she pointed toward the darker shadows at the edge of camp. Swallowing her fear, Sarah tucked the precious locket securely inside her dress, adjusted her hold on Ayana, and followed. They moved like ghosts through the chaos, Kiona leading them on a circuitous route that avoided the worst of the fighting. Twice they froze in the shadows as Dixon's men passed nearby, their voices harsh with greed and bloodlust. Once, crouched behind a rocky outcropping, Sarah caught a glimpse of Reese Dixon himself, a broad-shouldered silhouette barking orders as his men systematically searched each wiki-up. "They look for the white woman," Kiona whispered, her English broken but understandable. "For the baby. For the silver paper." The eastern ravine loomed ahead, a darker slash against the night sky. As they began their ascent, the sounds of battle grew more distant, though the orange glow of flames still lit the horizon behind them. The terrain grew steeper, the path barely visible in the darkness, but Kiona moved with the surety of long familiarity, occasionally reaching back to steady Sarah on particularly treacherous sections. Ayana remained miraculously quiet throughout the journey, as if the infant somehow understood the need for silence. Only when they finally reached the cave entrance, a narrow fissure in the rock face, partially concealed by scrub brush, did she begin to fuss, her tiny face scrunching with hunger and discomfort. Inside, the cave opened into a larger chamber, dry and relatively warm. Nijoni was already there, having taken a different route, and had prepared a small fire in a stone circle. The smoke disappeared through some unseen chimney in the rock, leaving the air clear enough to breathe comfortably. "Safe place," Kiona explained, gesturing around. "Old place. Spirits protect." Sarah sank onto a pile of blankets, exhaustion washing over her as the adrenaline of their flight began to fade. She looked down at Ayana, now whimpering more insistently, and automatically began the soothing motions that had become second nature over the past days. Nijoni approached with a small pouch of something that looked like crushed grain mixed with dried berries. She mimed mixing it with water to form a thin gruel, suitable for the baby. Sarah accepted it gratefully, the simple task of feeding Ayana a welcome distraction from her worry about what was happening back at the camp. Time passed with excruciating slowness. Kiona left briefly, returning with news that the fighting continued, though the Apache warriors had managed to drive Dixon's men back toward the south end of the valley. Nijoni dozed fitfully by the fire, her weathered face troubled even in sleep. Sarah remained awake, every sense alert, starting at each sound from outside. It was near dawn when they heard footsteps approaching the cave entrance. Kiona immediately moved to a defensive position, a knife appearing in her hand from some hidden sheath. Nijoni woke instantly, gathering up Ayana and retreating deeper into the shadows of the cave. Sarah stood frozen, her heart pounding in her throat as a figure filled the entrance. Tall, broad-shouldered, silhouetted against the first pale light of dawn. "Takoda?" she whispered, hope and fear tangled in the single word. The figure stepped forward into the firelight, and Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. It was indeed Takoda, though blood stained his right arm and a new cut slashed across his left cheekbone. His eyes swept the cave, landing first on Ayana in Nijoni's arms, then moving to Sarah's face with an intensity that stole her breath. "Dixon is dead," he said without preamble. "Most of his men have fled. Nahele pursues them to ensure they do not return." "The camp?" Sarah asked anxiously. "Damaged but standing. 3 wiki-ups burned completely. 4 of our people wounded, none killed." A grim satisfaction colored his voice. "We were more fortunate than the bounty hunters." He crossed to where Nijoni sat with Ayana, crouching down to place a gentle hand on the baby's head. Something passed between him and his grandmother, an unspoken communication that ended with Nijoni nodding solemnly and placing Ayana in his arms. Takoda rose, cradling his niece with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the warrior who had just returned from battle. He approached Sarah, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "I owe you an apology, Sarah Bennett," he said, his voice low and formal. Sarah blinked in surprise. "For what?" "When we first met, I thought you had stolen my sister's child. I threatened your life. I treated you as an enemy." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "I was wrong." The simple admission from a man of such pride left Sarah momentarily speechless. Before she could formulate a response, Takoda continued. "The locket," he said, gesturing to where it lay hidden beneath her dress. "It belongs to Ayana now, as does the claim it contains. My sister and her husband intended it for their daughter's future, a bridge between 2 worlds." He looked down at the sleeping infant, his expression softening, like Ayana herself. "What will happen now?" Sarah asked quietly. "The council has decided," Takoda replied. "The claim will be registered properly in Phoenix, with a portion set aside for our tribe's benefit. As for Ayana..." His eyes met Sarah's, something vulnerable flickering in their depths. "She needs someone who understands both worlds, someone with a brave heart and gentle hands." Sarah felt a trembling begin deep inside her, a fragile hope taking root. "Are you asking me to stay, to help raise her?" "I am asking more than that," Takoda said, his voice rough with emotion. "I am asking you to consider a path that few have walked. A life between worlds, neither fully Apache nor fully white, but something new. Something that might, in its small way, begin to heal old wounds." He held out Ayana, and Sarah took the baby into her arms, the familiar weight settling against her chest like it belonged there. Like she belonged there. "It would not be easy," Takoda warned. "There would be those on both sides who would call us traitors or worse." "Like Naheli," Sarah said softly, "even Naheli may learn in time that hatred is a heavier burden than acceptance." Takoda's hand moved to touch the silver locket that hung between them, his fingers brushing against Sarah's collarbone. "My sister believed this was possible. She died for that belief." The first ray of sunrise pierced through the cave entrance, illuminating them in golden light. In that moment, with Ayana sleeping peacefully between them and Takoda's dark eyes reflecting the dawn, Sarah made her choice. "I'll stay," she said simply. Later, as they made their way back down to the camp, Sarah carrying Ayana while Takoda walked beside her, she felt the weight of the silver locket against her skin. It was no longer just a piece of jewelry or a valuable claim, but a promise of a future neither of them could have imagined days ago, of a child who would grow up knowing both sides of her heritage, of a love that had begun in suspicion but might, with care and courage, blossom into something stronger than the divisions that had shaped their world. Around Ayana's neck, catching the morning light as she stirred in Sarah's arms, hung a small wooden amulet carved by Takoda's own hand, paired with the silver locket like a symbol of the two paths that had converged to bring them all to this moment, to this beginning.